Hi friend, welcome to A Water Connection, a space created to learn, connect, and multiply the power of a conversation to give visibility to the water industry. I'm Jess Borges, a passionate human being who believes you should increase your water curiosity. Welcome to this new episode. Today, I'm sitting with Professor Anne Poelina, who has joined us today to share some of her extensive wisdom about Indigenous water knowledge around Australia and the importance of Martuwarra or Fitzroy River in the Kimberley region in Western Australia. Professor Anne is a Nyikina Warrwa woman from the Kimberley region of Western Australia. She's an active community leader, human and earth right advocate, filmmaker, and respected academic researcher. Over the last 30 years, she has employed a powerful combination of public engagement, peer review academic papers, podcasts, community meetings, poetry, and storytelling to share the lived experience of Indigenous people, and has led a battle to safeguard Martuwarra or Fitzroy River from threats posed by mining, fracking, and water extraction in Western Australia. As a chair of the Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council, Anne wants to ensure the river is protected for generations to come, providing water security and benefits to the surrounding communities. Welcome to A Water Connection, Anne.
Jai Boro Ngajunu Nilawal Anne Poelina Ngayo Imarwara Manan Ngai Mandajara Nyikina Nganga in Broome in Jugunanyaru country, which is my home. So in my language I said, welcome to this country. It's magnificent. My name is Anne Poelina and I'm a woman who belongs to the Martuwarra, the Fitzroy River. So in terms of property rights, the river owns me and I'm duty bound by a moral obligation to protect this river, as you said. Not only its right to life, but its right to continue to flow for generations to come. So the river is everything. It's created my identity. It has given me the laws, the moral obligation to look after the river, to care for it. But one of the things is for us as Indigenous people is that we come from a world of we, not me. And so the we now includes settler society and our friends, non-Indigenous people who live in the region as well. So one of the things that we're looking at, particularly in terms of this amazing system, is to be able to bring in the voices of multiple people so that we can sit around the table and have a conversation about how we make the decisions now for future generations to come. In my language, I also have a word called Bugaragara. Bugaragara is the dreaming time, the time to fuse what we learned from the past to bring it into the present and to think about the future. So from this perspective, we were always thinking about not just people that had lived here, but people yet to be born. So this duty of care goes across intergenerations, it goes across time, but also water, particularly in this country and globally, is public interest matters. It's an asset in common, as the commons were for all of us to share our common good. So, from this perspective, the conversations that we have in the Martuwarra and why we think that this catchment is so globally unique and belongs not just to Australians, but indeed the world, is that this is an amazing place. There is not another river system like it anywhere else on the planet. A 600,000 square kilometre basin, the Canning Basin, that holds the river system, diverse valley tracts, diverse ways that Indigenous people have governed this system from the beginning of time. Because one of the things I say, particularly as a Peter Cullen Fellow, is that Indigenous people, we are the first people that managed the first water industry globally. So there's a lot of this knowledge that we want to bring to the table in terms of how we read this. And one of the things I've really been labouring is this traditional knowledge is Indigenous science. It is knowledge that's been generated over thousands and thousands of years of trial and error and better practice. And the fact that we as Indigenous people in this country, we live with the Anthropocene. I've got pearl shell carvings from some of my senior people that show diprotodon fully fleshed. So, what we're saying is that we have a saying as well called wake up the snake. How do you wake up the consciousness of the people to bring the people with you? Because we have the story that water is life, it holds life, it brings life. And that's one of the other frames for the Martuwarra. Martuwarra River of Life, because that's what it does. It's a living system that gives life to everything around us. And so the connectivity, the balance, the peace, the harmony, we need to read this system and understand it from a collective whole-scale approach. And that's why most of our work is really around looking at leadership and governance at scale, because one of the big things, as you know, is that everything is connected. And for us as Indigenous people, we don't separate land, water, environment and people. They're all intrinsically entwined. And yet when we live in a nation state that separates everything in terms of this is for mining, this is for land, this is for the environment, this is for people, this is for energy, we get this disjointed impact in terms of how we see things holistically and collectively. So from that little intro, just saying that thank you for your time and thank you for inviting me. But what we're doing on this conversation is really making it feel that water is everybody's business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much for joining us. Look, you basically covered all my questions with that introduction. So I'll start in like as part by part and then we'll go unpacking it. But it was beautifully how you started very naturally describing the picture of the Martuwarra. And that's how I wanted to start. Like for someone that is maybe not familiar with the Kimberley region, myself included, I actually have not found myself there yet. Would you help us paint in a picture of this region out there and the Martuwarra?
Yeah. It's amazing because we had someone from UNESCO contact us, sometime last year, and they said, "Are you interested in building a living water museum, bricks and mortar?" And I didn't even need to think about it. I said, "No, we don't need bricks and mortar because the river has got its own infrastructure, its own valley tracts, its own diversity, biodiversity, cultural diversity, all of these different things." And I said, why don't we think about the river being listed as a living water museum? And so UNESCO has recognised it as a living water museum.
Okay.
And in Bali next year at the big World Water Conference, we will be taking much of our information to share how this river system is a living water museum. So I'm trying to sort of make a lot of firsts here so that we spotlight these precious places, not just here in the Kimberley, not just here in our nation, but globally. Because one of the things we say as Indigenous people across the planet is we have not walked away from the Garden of Eden. We have stayed there. We have tended it. We have loved it. We have cared for it. And these are the things that's coming out in the IPBEST report, is that these last bastions of biodiversity across the globe, Indigenous people as the guardians have been really protecting these spaces. And now these spaces are being spotlighted in terms of very quick, unjust, invasive development. So it's a kind of a way of, saying to fellow Australians, saying to planetary citizens, this place is so amazing. It's so diverse. And someone like me, going into my 70s, there's still places I have not been along the river country. Wow. So it gives up its secrets slowly. It is extremely diverse because of the uplift, the folds and the fractures that lift the country up and put it down. You hear the stories from the elders, and now what we're finding is understanding that through paleontological marine investigations, where basically what it's showing is that Indigenous people live further out to sea, and over time they've come into this landscape. And the stories that we hold and we pass from generation to generation, what the scientists are finding when they're out there doing these dives is that these places that Indigenous people tell in stories, they actually exist out there in the marine environment.
In the marine.
So all of this knowledge, that's what we're saying, is that we are dealing with, particularly when we talk about water, we are dealing with complexity. And so we need collective wisdom. And so unless Indigenous voices, Indigenous wisdom, Indigenous science is not factored into the system science thinking, we won't be able to do what we need to do in order to ensure that young people not born yet can move into not just water justice, but climate justice and a climate chance.
Absolutely. And with such a big basin, as you mentioned earlier, I forgot the number, but how many nations, like First People nations, are around in this basin?
About nine different nations. Yeah. It's a totally different language, total different, sort of cultural landscapes. Everyone tends to manage their own estates or their own Rome. And so we become very much embedded in place because it's place-based leadership, it's place-based governance, it's place-based development. But the point we're making as Indigenous leaders is that from the beginning of time, we had law and a framework, a leadership and governance framework that always looked at it from a full catchment perspective. When anthropologists and archaeologists came here in the beginning of time, one of the things they said is that we are connected by what we call Wallangari law as Martuwarra people. So it saw us as sameness and a collective way of bringing unity, peace, understanding impacts that are happening over time and on scale. So this is why what we're saying, and I recently published a paper with Natalie Stoynoff and Shan Turnbull showing that polycentric governance, the way we govern from the bottom up, but dealt on a bioregional scale, is so important, because we need to understand cumulative impacts of risk, cumulative impacts of demand, but also cumulative impacts of different forms of economy as well. And so that's one of the things that we're advocating, is that what is the sunk cost investment of this amazing place? When we look at some of the development that's happening, we want to be able to offer an alternative. So things like global geoparks, biosphere reserves, culture and science tourism, all of those things are here. So one of the things that we've started to do through the Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council is starting to create walking trails along country, because we believe a lot of this is about developing a sense of values, ethics of care. And unless you can go to place and feel the land,
And see it,
hear
yeah.
the land and see the land, how can you create empathy and a sense of care for this precious resource? As I said, it belongs to the world, but it definitely belongs to current and future generations of our young people.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, like about that first. I don't know if you mentioned it right now, but I've read it from your material around the first law and how the system was managed before settling, like settlers came from Europe. I was very curious into knowing that, and you touch a little bit into this, like it was place based, and everyone was communicating at a basin level. How does that work? Like, it's amazing how it used to work before Europeans arrived.
Yeah, I think, the really critical thing is all about ethics and the human spirit, and how we need to build this ethics of care, relationship and connectivity to country, to feel the land, to dance upon it, to walk upon it, to engage with it, because it is a living system. So when we are born here in the Kimberley, we are given what we call a totem or a judin, which is an animal. It can be a bird, it can be some creature, but we are bonded for life to that creature. And our duty of
Yeah.
care is to learn as much as we can about that creature. And as I keep saying, who could believe that an animal can teach us how to be good and decent human beings? So it's about values, it's about ethics, it's about virtues, it's about looking at this and thinking not just for now, but for future generations to come. So it balances on those sorts of principles, but the key principle that comes out of it is really about igniting the human spirit, have a consciousness that we live within a space that we're trying to contain peace, harmony and balance. And so we have to grow this sense of empathy, this sense of care. But also one of the things about First Law is that it's self-regulatory. These are the rules we negotiate. How are we going to live together in peace and harmony? This is what we're going to do. Are these the values that you aspire to, so we can keep a civil society together and people bond in that moral obligation? Because as I said, our world starts with relationship, respect, reciprocity, not just rights, but responsibility. So this ethics of care that we instill in a creature, that really creates a sense that this is not just about human beings. This is about every living creature, including the birds, including the wind, including the sky, have the potential to be what it was designed to be. And so from that perspective, First Law is not so complicated. It really is the philosophical and ontological way we see and be in the world. And this is one of the things that we're saying, some of the writing that I've got is how to feel and hear the land. You know what I mean? So part of this is trying to get people, and it doesn't need to be here in the Kimberley. It can be wherever you are, Victor Harbour, down in the Kooyong Lakes, wherever you are, in the Birrawong, in Sydney, wherever you are. What we're saying is that you don't need to go anywhere. This land now belongs to you. You are part of country. You are part of this memory. And so the conversation that I particularly want to exercise is that we now see our fellow settlers, and particularly new Australians who've come to this country in the last 50 years, this is your home. How do you develop this sense of ethics and care? You belong here. Your children belong here. You are building new memories that are captured in this cultural landscape. So just getting people to sort of understand that it's nothing too exotic. Wherever you are, go and sit by the waters, go and stand beneath the tree, get to understand it, get to look at it, get to read it over time and place and space, and build a relationship with it. So it's those things of really creating that sense of relationship, connecting you to the land because you're now part of this country, understanding that Indigenous people don't separate land, water, people, and the environment, and trying to picture where you are at with building this relationship yourself. And, it starts off and people think a little bit, loopy in the head, but you will find that you will build a relationship with place if you invest in it. And you will notice things that you may not have noticed on the first day you sat or stood where you stood and sat. So it's all of those things in terms of, bringing all of fellow Australians with us in terms of this. We have got to do the best thing we can right now with our place, because our young people, particularly in terms of ensuring intergenerational equity, is really relying on the ancestralness of all of us collectively to do the right thing with our nation, so that the young people can have certainty and a future that they can continue to dream in and reach their full potential.
That's a beautiful description of it, and you mentioned that it's not something that out of the like that different, or like you used another word that I missed it, but I feel like it's a completely different way of seeing the world, and it's such a beautiful and profound way to do it, especially when you are not only living on the land, but you're connecting with it and you're paying attention to what is happening. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I wanted to touch on, we talked earlier about the Murray-Darling Basin off the record, which is a system that perhaps tends to be a bit more familiar to people here in Australia. And I know you have been heavily involved in work in this area as well. And as I was reading a little bit, and from what you're saying from the Martuwarra region as well, I see some similarities, but I want you to ask, what is it different between the Murray-Darling Basin and the Martuwarra? I know that the management of it has been completely different, and I'll go into that in a minute. But I was curious to know, maybe before all this current management has happened, like what was similar and what was different between these two very important basins for Australia?
Yeah, I think in terms of what's similar, and this is sort of, part of the hard work that I'm trying to sort of push through the barriers, is everything needs to be seen on scale. One of the things we've done in this country is that we've mapped 89 watersheds, bioregions around the nation, where we could look at these sorts of approaches from a bioregional, biocultural approach. So one of the things I'm saying is that when you look at the scale of the Murray-Darling Basin and all the jurisdictions that intersect, it does bring a level of complexity that makes business hard to do. And so one of the things that, I'm challenged by this, because as you said, I sit as an independent scientist on the ACSI committee on the Murray-Darling Basin, and we're, moving into a review period. And one of the things that keeps challenging me in my mind, particularly being an Indigenous person and being a leader who's very much focused on water, is how did we govern before you people came here? And it's from that bioregional framework where we need to see things on scale. And I think one of the big things with the Murray-Darling Basin is we need to look at more place-based governance. How do we bring all of us to the table? How do we sit around the table? Farmers, miners, Indigenous people, agriculture, everyone. How do we sit around the table and go, okay, what do you want to do here? What's the cumulative impact of what you want to do? How is it going to impact on each of us? If there's no, negative impacts, bring it on. And how then do we, monitor it, evaluate it, keep an idea on process? Because the biggest disease we have at the moment, dis-ease, not disease, is climate change. I call it climate chaos, because there's so much uncertainty. And so one of the things we need to understand is that there are impacts that we have done as human beings across the planet that has caused this planetary crisis. And so we need to be able to look at ways of coming together at the regional level, coming together at place-based levels, sitting around the table, putting the information on the table, understanding the complexity of what we're talking about, most importantly, understanding cumulative impacts of risk, demand, but also opportunities. So one of the things I've seen, particularly working in the Murray-Darling Basin, is this idea that how do we prevent this disaster happening in the Kimberley? How do we prevent this disaster happening in a region that everybody's looking at right now? Because we don't have water trading, we don't have water markets. Up until late last year, we were moving on the development of new water laws so that we could start to bring, multiple bits of legislation, bring in one law and be able to look at where we're going. So one of the things that was advocated in the Murray-Darling Basin was the need to form some sort of statutory catchment, a way for different stakeholder groups to come together. But that has really been quite difficult across all of the jurisdictions because a lot of this requires the goodwill and the good faith of governments to invest and to look at not only how do they support the multinational companies, but how do they support communities? What's the plan for becoming resilient, adapting to climate change, understanding that at some point we can't keep doing business as usual in terms of continuing to create fugitive emissions that are going to impact on us in this nation, but across the world. So really, when I look at the Murray-Darling Basin, my head is always thinking, how do we prevent that disaster? And I kind of figure we were sort of moving towards that dialogic process, but at the moment, the state government is not wanting to enter into a conversation about water law. So that leaves a lot of uncertainty because what it does when you don't have a framework to bring everybody to the table, it creates a conflict paradigm. It really, people start to get into a competitive mode. Water is just seen as a resource. And what we're saying is that we are taking a public good, we're giving it to multinational companies to privatize and then produce profit for themselves. So what we're really talking about is the politics of economics. What we're talking about is we need to slow down in this country. We need a total reset, as my friend Greg Campbell has written a most amazing book to show that we can't keep doing business as usual and we need another way. So I kind of figure at the moment what I'm saying to everyone, and this is really interesting because I've just taken on the Associate Commissioner role for the National Water Initiative, looking at, where are we going with water in this nation. And so these are some of the big issues that keep coming up. And I know that we are contained towards focusing on the 2022 story. So what I'm really trying to encourage is the public comment period is probably over, but one of the things that will come out is an opportunity for an interim report from the Productivity Commission. And I'm really wanting to send a real serious call out there to the public, to ordinary everyday people, as well as big business and multinational corporations, to read the interim report. And if there's anything in there we missed, and you have got an evidence-based approach to why we should be thinking differently and more from that scale level, then please let us know. But this is the point right now. And I guess, as I said earlier, one of the big issues is going into a space that is amazing river system, 733 kilometres, National Heritage listed, the largest registered Aboriginal cultural heritage site in Western Australia. And yet one of the things that we're looking at is potentially changing this system in a time when we are really seeing the changes on country. For the last 2 years, I've been working with an amazing group of Aboriginal people, community research practitioners, and we're looking to diversify the workforce. So we're calling them the Martuwarra River Keepers. So over the last 2 years, one of the things that sent us down this story was the fact that in Africa, many of the big baobab trees are imploding because the water table is shifting. And because we've got the only other very, very similar species genus in the Kimberley, we thought it was important to start to monitor what was the table doing, what was climate showing us in terms of water scarcity, food insecurity, medicine insecurity. And what it's shown us is that this area is changing very, very fast. So living water systems are starting to retreat. The trees and the plants and the medicines are not fruiting the way they were. which is really important because the people who live here live in abject poverty and survive on $14,000 a year. And so therefore, this whole, in a way, hybrid economy, living on the land, accessing hunting and gathering of food and medicine, really lifts their quality of life quite extensively and extremely. And so what we're seeing now is we're doing a really amazing partnership with the state government through the Department of Environment and Water Regulations. They've funded the university of where I'm at, the University of Notre Dame, and there's a partnership with the Martuwarra Council. And what we're looking at over the next 3 years is looking at what are the impacts and showing us that country is changing, but importantly, what are going to be the mechanisms that keep Indigenous people resilient with the ability to adapt. And obviously, one of the big things in sight is understanding that we've got very, very big projects on our doorstep, which we're very concerned about. And one of the things we're saying is that it shouldn't be a trade-off. We should be able to sit at the table, have a decent conversation. Where can we do this? Can we do this? And what will the impacts be? So it's all about dialogue. It's all about dialogic action. It's all about throwing up new ideas, testing them, seeing where they can go and not go. But most importantly, be aware of what are the risks of what you're doing. Because one of the things I keep saying is we're sitting on a basin, 500,000 square kilometres onshore, 100,000 square kilometres offshore. I'm concerned that if we start to frack this system, it's highly likely we will create the largest man-made destruction on the planet. So it's quite frightening. And so I'm really keen to sort of see where the state government is sitting in terms of looking at a way to bring everybody together so we can understand what is proposed, because we need a cooperative way to work together. It needs to be evidence-based. We need to understand not just environmental impacts, but what are going to be the social impacts on Indigenous people and fellow people who live in the region, who call the Kimberley their home, have invested here for generations. Many people do not understand what is planned for this region. And then on the other hand, we've got the Commonwealth government saying, this is an amazing system. We registered as National Heritage in 2011. And the Commonwealth has invested in looking at how can we work towards World Heritage? Because what I'm arguing or what I'm advocating is that the forever industries that I talk about, where we're not doing destruction, biosphere reserves, global geoparks, science, culture, tourism, these are what I call the forever industries, and the impact is great and with very, very little risk. And they go forever if we sustain the system we have. So there's an economic imperative, and one of the things that we are saying as Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council to government is, in a way, you need to prove to us how what you want to do is not going to impact on us negatively. And we need the time and the resources to generate the evidence base to say that what our proposition around the new economies can be and should be need to be invested, because we believe that fellow Australians are also wanting to come and be part of this place.
Absolutely. I really want to go and visit after all of this that I've been learning from you. So absolutely. And I think one of the things, it keeps coming up in our conversation, and I heard it as well in the conversation you had with Rachel Hawking as part of the series of 100 climate conversations at the Powerhouse Museum, which, by the way, if you're listening, I'll leave a link to this episode in the show notes, and also links to how honored I am that you're here with me if you were at one of those 100 climate conversations. But what kept coming there over and over, and it has been coming here, is the importance of collective wisdom, of like two-way science, of like working together, of like really seeing each other as a community instead of like different stakeholders just fighting for different things. From your experience and the world that you have seen and done around the world, what are like these steps that we can take to actually make sure that our future decisions are made following those principles? We have talked about like, let's sit all of us in the table, what else can we start doing so we flip that mindset in our decision making in the future?
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I guess this is sort of like from policy to science to law to regulation to compliance. So this is one of those situations where I also write about lawful, awful laws. So we have laws that are no longer fit for purpose, no longer fit for the environment, no longer fit, to bring people together. I'm also very, very clear in terms of the just energy transition needs to include those communities that are currently working in coal. And so what we're saying is that we care about those communities. They have built communities. And so if there is to be a just transition, we want the investment into those communities so that those people can be upskilled, uptooled, and be part of the transition. So they're part of the story in terms of how we build a future together. So one of the big things is also to be very, in a way, advocate. If you see that there's laws in your state that are not fit for purpose, I know there's conversations in Western Australia where we're looking at the Environmental Protection Authority and sort of thinking, well, what's its real purpose? I think these checks and balances in society need to be sustained, maintained, and fully resourced, so that these systems that we go in, even as limited as they are, give the people a level of certainty that, hey, government cares. Because at the moment, right now, you would not see that picture in our nation. We've got an open door policy for big multinational companies. We've privatised our systems that we once had as public benefits, Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, utilities. So we've privatised and we've subsidised, and we've given a hand up to the multinational corporations. And I think ordinary, everyday people want to know that government care about them, and looking at how can we do this in a way that's going to protect the well-being and peace, balance and harmony of everything around us. And that includes whether you live in an urban place like, Melbourne or Sydney or whatever. What we're saying is that the critical element in terms of having a good life, having a meaningful life, is to have good leadership, good governance, and the notion that when we do these big development projects, that some of those earnings need to be coming back into our own societies, into our own communities, so we can also have a benefit from what's being extracted and taken from the land, so that it's not just the multinationals that are benefiting, that ordinary everyday people can see that government is investing in the social good. So, there's some very hard conversations to be had in terms of where do we put our resources, conversations around tax incentives, all of those things. And I think really when I hear the cry of our people nationally, what we need is a hand up for the people, not a handout for the companies all the time and creating that division. So I think there's, good business to be made. Some of the big companies are also starting to think about a bit ethically in terms of climate change, climate risk. How do they mitigate those sorts of things? What does insurance look like? And I think really when you look at what the world is seeing from our nation state, we're not very well high profiled into the good that we're doing in this country to reduce fugitive emissions and think about the fact that we are living in one bubble called planet Earth, and everything we do here has a ripple effect wherever we go, across the oceans, across the skies. So it's trying to get people to look beyond their individualism to the fact that we come from a collective world and that this wisdom needs to be shared and we all need to guide it. And we need to think about not just failing policies, but lawful, awful laws that do not bring about justice and equity, not just for the environment, but for the people as well. And find new ways to create economies that are not destructive, that can sustain the planet, that can give our young people a climate chance.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions I ask all my guests is, what do you think is the biggest challenge that the water sector is facing? And we have been talking about those, but I'm happy for you to kind of elaborate on that as well. And yeah, what do you think is that biggest challenge that we have facing forward, and where Indigenous knowledge can play a key role?
Yeah, well, besides the fact that I really am about bicultural, bioregional leadership and governance, I think over the last couple of months, one of the things that's really, I've sort of looked at this objectively and kind of go, okay, if you had a magic wand and could create a law right now to allow the people to have certainty, what would that wish be? And my wish is currently at the moment, there's a conversation at the Commonwealth Government level about the water trigger. And I think what we need to do is be brave and bring that water trigger in so that it's not just a trigger, it actually becomes a new water law. And that way it would give us certainty. So for me, what I'm saying in terms of the work that I'm currently doing, where I come from, where I want to go to, one of the things I say is that if we brought in the water trigger, it would then give people in the communities that little bit of extra faith, good faith, that, hey, there's a mechanism to just slow processes down until we can make sure we're evidence-based, understand the impacts of these things, because the original water trigger was introduced by Tony Windsor and was introduced because on the East Coast they were talking about coal seam gas. These big projects with fracking and drilling down and getting these large volumes of gas and oil and that they want to extract, we're going, 5 to 7 kilometres. So when we're fracturing the land, we're fracturing the whole bedrock and the whole backbone of the country, and that these fugitive emissions don't just come up one pipe, they come up through the country. So the impacts of that here in the Kimberley, particularly because our soils are becoming more and more hydrophobic, they're not holding moisture. So when wildfires come and lightning strikes, it just burns massively, wildfires out of control. So what I'm saying is that we need to slow down. We need to think about the impacts we're having. We need to think about why are we extracting for whose intent, whose purpose, how is that capital being dispersed? But most importantly for me, as I said, if someone gave me a magic wand, I would already be waving it so that the water trigger could become water law, to give the people and the community some sense of certainty that there's rigour in terms of managing these big projects that are coming on board, that there's an extra set of lens that can make sure that these precautionary principles are adhered to. And we need to ground all of our work in multiple ways of science so that we can be informed about the decision making. But at the same time, thinking about what are the alternative economies? How can we continue to generate wealth creation for people in the regions? And how can people in the regions have a voice either to the state or federal level that says that we need to be thinking about development in a different way?
Yeah, for sure. And what would be your message to young water professionals who might be listening to you? Maybe they work in a completely different area in the water sector. Maybe they have never heard of the Kimberley or anything like this before. What would be your message to them?
Well, I think one of the things is to open your mind about what is knowledge, what is wisdom. There's some amazing researchers that are publishing in this area, Sue Jackson, Erin O'Donnell, people from over in New Zealand, it's just, there's so much out there. And one of the things I'm saying is that be brave, push your thinking beyond what you currently know, take the risk and learn and have an understanding. Most importantly, connect with Indigenous water leaders and see and be in the world, particularly the water world, a different way.
Oh, well, that's amazing. Very inspiring. And just to wrap it up with one question I asked all my guests as well. Why do you work in water?
Why do I work in water? Why do I do what I do? And for me, it's not a job. It's destiny. I come from the river. I'm part of the river. Water is what I know. I see the impacts in terms of how it is life to everything else around us. And so for me, this is my destiny. As I said, I'm a very privileged Peter Cullen Fellow. I learned a lot from that. But in my mind, whatever decisions, whatever challenges I have Peter Cullen's voice behind me. And I say, what would Peter do? What would Peter think? And I've never met the man, but it has embedded in me this sense, a concept of be brave, push the boundaries, get out there, test the system, expand it, open it up with new ideas, publish, make sure you have well-documented information so that it's not just hearsay, that you have got rigor in what you do and you've got standards. And as I say, this is about all of us. We are in a world of we, not me, and we are in a moment in time where we are challenged by so many things around us. But climate change is the major dis-ease, and we have, as humans, have created that level of chaos and uncertainty. So it's now up to human beings to be able to find the solutions to ensure our young people do have a climate chance.
That's right, and thank you very much for your time today. This has been a very inspiring talk. I think even thinking in this last question that I asked people, and you say it's my destiny, it's not my job, is already pushing the boundaries of what I think, of what I do as well. And a lot of the people that I have here, which they are like motivated by helping the community, by providing an essential service. And maybe it is all our destiny to actually be doing this. So thank you very much for being here today with us, for teaching us that we against the I mentality, and really to put all this into perspective for us to keep being brave and keep pushing boundaries next to you.
No, thanks,
you.
Jess. And Galio Mabu in my language means we will see each other again. It's not goodbye.
For sure.
Okay.
I hope so. And to you, my friend, thank you very much for tuning in and for listening to this wonderful episode of our Water Connection. I hope you enjoyed the ride. Please follow us on LinkedIn and share this with friends, with someone that you might think that they found this interesting, and let us know what you think. See you next
And
time.
come to the Kimberleys and to the Fitzroy River, because
Yes.
what I say
Yes.
is whether you come for one day, one night, once you've been here, you're always a part of it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that wonderful invitation. See you next time.